Bruner, and I have the pleasure today of interviewing Mr. Jesús Valdez. He is in St. Anne, Illinois, but he used to live in Windsor, come to Windsor in the summer as part of the migrant camp. And today is August 28th, 2020. So, Mr. Valdez, would you go ahead and introduce yourselves, tell us your age, just a little bit of background, and then we'll get started with some questions.
Okay, yes, my name is Jesús Valdez. I have four ways of giving my age. One of them is a chronological age, which I hardly ever use. When I used to teach at school for a couple of years, children would ask me how old I was. I would tell them I'm 1 year, 1 month, and 2 days older than my wife. So naturally they would say, well, how old is your wife? And I would say, I am 1 year, 1 month. She is 1 year, 1 month, and 2 days younger than I am. Another way of giving my age is I took a survey once on a website called realage.com. And it said I was about 9 years younger than my chronological age. But my favorite way of saying my age is in dog years, I'm only about 11 years old.
Okay, so just tell us what year you were born. For historical purposes.
I'm actually 76 years old.
Okay. Well, good.
And
so,
I've been retired now for 14 years. I worked about 40 years in manufacturing. I did several states as a plant manager, manufacturing managers for several companies across Texas, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Illinois. And when my grandchildren were born, I retired. I took early retirement so I could enjoy my grandkids. And
good
so
point.
I retired, like I said, about 14 years ago, and so here I am.
All right. So, what years did you live in Windsor? Was it in the summer as part of the migrant camp, or did you ever live here year-round?
It's been quite a few years, of course, and my memory is not very exact, but I think right around 1954 or maybe even 55, we started coming down to Windsor. And we did that continuously until about 1962. 1 or 2 of those years, we lived in that labor camp, which was my point of interest in contacting the Historical Society. My son lives there in the Windsor area. And so we came to visit him and his family. And of course, being so close to Windsor, I wanted to see where the old points of interest were for me from way back when. And of course, Windsor looks nothing like it used to look, or what I remembered, other than the Windsor Lake. That one I remember, but even that looks totally different from what I can recall. So my interest was just merely in trying to find out if I could make some points of contact to where those areas that I used to visit. The labor camp was one of them. I don't remember much about it other than that it was a one-room cabin. It had bunk beds. It had a gas stove with 2 burners and maybe a table. But other than that, I don't remember much about it. I remember working several farms. One of them that I recall, it was a field that was close to the highway that runs between the lake. I think it's 287. Mm-hmm. And I remember that from the working field, we used to see the cars coming down, and there was somebody there's always waiting to catch the speedsters. And we always thought that was very entertaining to watch. He always caught somebody. Another item that I remember was the theater. It was run by an old gentleman whose name I cannot recall. But I think we had Mexican movies once every weekend, probably on Saturdays. And on one occasion, he showed Around the World in 80 Days. That must have been 1956. That's when the movie was released. I remember that specifically because he got up on the stage and he mentioned that one of the actors was a Mexican actor. His name is Cantinflas. And he mentioned that at that time, this comedian had become the highest paid comedian in the world because of his performance in that movie. That one I remember very well. I remember the kindness of a barber. Back then, we were used to getting a haircut once every 2 weeks, because when we went to school, if we let our hair grow any longer than after 2 weeks, they would send us home. So I used to go get a haircut there every 2 weeks or so. And I always grabbed a magazine to read. And on one occasion, the barber said he took note and he gave me a whole bunch of magazines. They were probably the kind like Time, Newsweek, Life magazine. I still remember that to this day. I really appreciated that. Another thing I remember is most of the farmers that we worked for were German or of German origin. And they used to teach me a little bit of German. I forgot most of it, of course, but I can still remember one phrase, Ich spreche nicht Deutsch, which I think means I don't speak German. Mm-hmm. Another person I remember is a farmer by the name of George Sanders. Could have been Saunders. But the reason I remember is because my father bought our first car from him. It was a 1941 Chevy. And I still remember that car. Also, we lived in a house that was just a couple of blocks from his farmhouse. And remember I used to go to visit with his son. He was about my age, and we used to play. And they had a horse, and I used to ride the horses sometimes. That's a fond memory for me also. And another fond memory that I recall is a farmer once, his farm was a little bit south of Windsor, maybe a little bit distant up on the hills. Mm-hmm. I don't recall what road it was or how far it was, but my father asked him for some gas money. And the farmer said, sure. But after we got done with the job, he said, how about if I give you a little goat? And my father said, sure, we'll take the goat. It was a baby goat, and he became my pet. And he would go everywhere I went. He followed me. And when I went to bed to sleep, he would lie down in bed with me and put his neck on my neck, right around here. And so we both slept together. Now, during the daytime, I would go, and if we weren't working, we would go to an alfalfa field that was next to the labor camp, and I would take him out there, and he would eat some alfalfa. Wherever we went, he would go. After Windsor, we would go to, the year we had this billy goat, we went to Nebraska, and he went with us in the car. We would take him to work in the fields. And from Nebraska, we usually went back to Texas, to the Panhandle, which is around the Lubbock, Amarillo area, and we would pick cotton. And the goat would go with us. He would always join me in the field. Took him back to Texas, and he was a little bit more grown by that time. And I used to pull his tail. And when I did that, he would start to buck me. But I knew him very well, so I could always hold him with my hand. But when my friends would come to visit, and they would want to look at the goat, I would pull his tail, and he would try to buck them. And of course, they would run away. But yeah, it was nice. We would work like maybe the month of July and most of August in Windsor.
You pick pickles or thin beets or?
we picked pickles. There was quite a few people there at the time. The labor camp was usually full. We did not do beets at the time there in Windsor. We would do beets in Wyoming.
Okay.
So our itinerary usually ran from early to mid-May in Wyoming to do beets, to thin beets at the time.
Around Lingle or where?
I'm sorry?
Where in Wyoming? Around Lingle or Torrington?
Yeah, right in that area. It was 2 or 3 different towns. But at that time, the beets were planted in a row, and they would be full of beet seeds. So you would have to thin them out to have only one plant every 9 inches or so. And after the thinning, we would do the weeding, make sure that there was no more weeds. And after that, then we would go to Windsor. We would do the pickles there. Even one year we did some potatoes there. After the pickles in Windsor, then we would move to Nebraska and we'd do potatoes. Sometimes we even came to Michigan and we picked cherries and apples. Then sometime in October, we would move back to Texas to do cotton.
Okay.
And most of the time, I didn't get back to school till about the end of October or the first of somewhere in the first week of November. So I would miss school from early May, mid-May to late October, early November. So, and you know, back then there was no assistance of any kind. I didn't miss it. I don't recall ever having any problems of any kind.
But you were curious. You read your Time magazines from the barber shop, and
yes, I've always been a reader. I always liked to read. I remember one time walking home from high school. I used to live 1 mile from high school, and I would walk at noon 1 mile, get lunch. It'd take me 15 minutes to walk the mile to get lunch at home. My mom already had lunch ready for me. It would take me 15 minutes to eat lunch, 15 minutes to go back to school. On the way somewhere, I would stop and buy a newspaper. And the owner of the store always looked at me and said, "You're doing good reading the newspaper."
oh.
Not very many kids would stop to buy a newspaper.
Yeah.
So yeah, I've always been a reader. And so 40, 50, almost 60 years later, here I am.
Yes.
I've got, my wife and I have been married 52 years. Come Monday.
Congratulations.
Thank you. We have 2 children. They have family. One is in Colorado with two kids. They're twins. And one is in Michigan. He's got 3 kids. And as far as I'm concerned, my legacy is all in my grandchildren.
That's wonderful. So you've made me curious about many things in your story. So the migrant labor camp, was that next to the sugar beet factory? Where were the houses actually located?
I don't recall the sugar
Windsor,
beet factory. Yeah. According to the picture, there's something right above the labor camp. And I think I read somewhere that it was they did straw or something like that. All I remember is that it was always there was always a smokestack.
Okay.
It was right above the labor camp, and some of the pollution would fall on the labor camp and dirty up the cars. I don't recall much about it other than that. I do recall there was a baseball park about, I don't know, a couple of blocks from the labor camp. And we used to go down there sometimes to watch the baseball games.
That was probably looking at, for point of reference, the cemetery field. And then that was the name of the baseball field, but they've now taken that down because they've expanded the cemetery. And then also there was the alfalfa plant right across from the sugar beet factory to the east. So they might have been located in there. So that's interesting. Now, when you pick pickles, where was the pickle dock, or tell us the process of how they rated or graded pickles and paid you for your work?
What I remember is during the day, of course, we would pick the pickles, and we always tried to pick as little as possible because they would get paid more for the little ones. And then in the afternoons, the farmer, we would load up the pickles. I think they were like little crates or maybe buckets. I really don't recall. But they would be loaded on the truck. The truck would go to the processing plant. They would dump them in a conveyor belt. And then that would separate the pickles by size, from the little bitty ones to the cucumbers, the big ones. The cucumbers were not very valuable at all, so we always tried to pick the little ones as best as possible. I never saw what happened after that. I guess I just wasn't that interested, or not really involved in the complete processing of the pickles. I don't recall where the processing plant was. I don't recall anything really too much about it other than what I just said.
Okay. So then, was how many brothers and sisters did you have picking with you in your family? And who, was the paycheck given to your father, or how was that processed?
Yeah, the paycheck was given to my father. There was the whole family. There was 4 of us. So yeah, we all worked together. My mother would get up before sunrise to make breakfast and lunch, and we would go to the field. We would eat in the field, and we would come back home, and then my mother would prepare dinner. My father would help along. The houses usually had electricity, but nothing else. There usually was no running water, not inside the house anyway. No gas stoves. Usually they were wooden stoves. So my father would chop the wood. My mother would then get the fire going. She controlled the heat. I remember she was very ingenious. She used some metal plates or something to control the heat so that if the stove was too hot, she would put more metal plates on top to control the level of heat. And if it cooled down, then she would remove the plates. And that way she would cook all our meals.
Wow. So what kinds of things were your favorite foods that your mom cooked on the wood burning stove or the kerosene stove?
Oh, I really don't recall. But I think from what I remember, we always had a little salad, a little meat, and then sometimes she would make potatoes or beans and rice, a lot of different things. We ate very well. We ate very well.
So then this George Sanders, that's very generous that he sold your father his first car. It was a 1941 model. How did you get here before that, before you had a car? How did you get around?
We started, you see, my family came from Mexico.
Okay.
And they had a mission in mind. At that time, the word mission-oriented did not exist, at least not in our vocabulary. But they were very mission-oriented. And their mission was to make sure that their children would be educated and have a better opportunity in the United States than what they would have in Mexico. Mm-hmm. So he first came to the United States and he worked at a creamery. The pay was just not enough to sustain his household. He had recently bought a house. It was a small house, but he found that coming up north, he could make a little more money to sustain the family. So in the early 50s, we would be loaded up on a truck. It was a big, like not a semi-truck, but a bobcat truck, something like that. Yeah, I think they call them bobcat. had some side rails. They would put a pole in the middle and then put a tarp, like a tent, and then put a gate at the end of the truck. And then they would load 2 or 3 families back there with all their belongings that they needed to work in the fields. And so they would truck us all the way up to the north, drop us off at a certain farm. Each family had a different farm. And they would come pick us up and take us to town on weekends to do our shopping. And that was I think, 1951 through probably 1954 until my father bought a car. And then after that, we just drove our own car.
Wow. And look at you now, all the, you know, that's an amazing work ethic and story as far as that. Now, what do you remember more about this George Sanders, the farmer that?
All I remember was we had a house, I think it belonged to him. It was about 2 or 3 blocks from his farmhouse. This house was right in front of an irrigation canal, a large canal. This canal would be filled with water when the farmers were going to use the water for irrigation. And then when the irrigation stopped, the water would go down. And we could wade into the water just maybe ankle deep. And there was crawfish there. I remember we would sit on the banks and take our shoes off and put our toes in the water, and the crawfish would come around and nibble on our toes. That I remember. Another thing I remember is I was running one day and there was a piece of iron sticking out of the ground, which I had not seen. And I still have a scar on my ankle for it. Another thing I remember is going down to his farmhouse to play with his son. And we would ride a horse. And that's about all I remember about that.
Then you went to town, and then on.
Yeah, I remember working with many different farmers, but the only name I recall is that one.
Yeah, was a wonderful man. And then you said that you would get to go to town on the weekends, or in Windsor Main Street, the theater that you went to was right on 5th and Main. Is that correct? Between not on the corner, but where the gazebo is. What was the theater like inside?
I really don't recall anything about the theater. All I recall is that they had movies there. I remember that some of those movies had some beautiful music. And so when I grew up a little bit more and went to high school, bought a guitar, and I tried to learn some of the music that they played in those movies. It was very typical Mexican music, completely different from what you hear nowadays. I read a story somewhere that said that after the age of 35, people will stop learning or listening to new music. They'll stick with their own music from before. So I basically stopped listening to the newer music a long time ago. I very hardly ever listened to the new music. But the old music stayed with me. And I learned that at Windsor, as a matter of fact. Because I don't recall going to the movies when I was in Texas.
Mm-hmm.
We worked 6 months out of the year in the fields. And when we went back to Texas, there was basically no work. And so whatever we earned during those 6 months would carry us through.
True.
We never went hungry. We never lacked for clothes. We never lacked for a house. We never lacked for shoes. We were always... we're in good shape. We had a good life. We appreciated coming to the North. I always viewed it as an adventure, driving through 1,500 miles nonstop to get to our destination. When we drove from, say, Colorado to Nebraska, that's another 1,500 miles. That was tiresome because the scenery is not very pretty on eastern Colorado or Nebraska or Iowa. It's very bare. Until you get to Illinois, you start seeing some trees, and we would get into sometimes go all the way up to Michigan. And of course, Michigan is a very pretty state. Colorado is very pretty also, of course, because of the mountains, but the eastern Colorado part of Mexico.
So how did you end up in Illinois? How did you end up, living in St. Anne, Illinois?
Well, I was working in Michigan, and they closed down that plant, so I came down to Illinois. I was supposed to be here only 5 years. At least that was my goal. And I retired after working here 6 years, and we just decided to stay here, and we've been here now 22 years, almost 22 years.
22 years. So what advice do you have for those of us who have not lived the adventures and the life experiences that you have, that we can know moving forward in our lives?
Well, like I said, our parents had a mission. They were mission oriented. They never looked for anything for themselves. Everything they got was for their children. I don't recall them ever going out shopping for clothes. I'm sure they bought their clothes, but they always made sure that their children had what they needed. I remember my mother talking to me almost on a daily basis. Make sure you keep going to school. Never stop going to school. Do your homework. Apply yourself. Our lives are never going to be any better than what they are today, but yours can be different. Never, ever give up on school. It was like a living, like a daily thing that I was spoken to. So in my mind, I never had any thoughts of ever leaving school. I never had any thoughts of not doing anything other than improving myself. And even when I was in high school, I remember telling my teacher, asked me one time, what are you planning to do when you graduate? And I said, I really don't know because I don't have money to go to college. And he said, money is no problem. There are plenty of people with money. There are plenty of institutions willing to lend you money. If you want to go to school, you go. I said, okay. So I took his advice. And I went to school. And I never looked back. In my mind, I was never going to be a migrant farmer all my life. In my mind, someday I was going to be educated and have a good job. Now my children, I have 2 boys. They both have master's degrees. They're both married. Both of their wives have master's degrees. They're both professional people. I also grew up to get a master's in business. I was not very smart, and my parents did not know anything about education. They were not literally educated. My father had a 2nd grade education in the United States, and he could speak English, but barely, but he made himself understood. My mother went to school in Mexico for 4 years. She was considered to be educated with a 4th grade education, but she was not really educated. But they knew one thing: education is the key. And they made sure that I got that education.
That's a wonderful, wonderful heritage and tribute, Jesus. Now, where did you go to college? Or
I went to a small school in Texas called, at the time it was called Texas A&M University. It's now part of Texas A&M University.
Uh-huh.
So my very first job was with the Exxon company in Houston. And there I was with a degree from a small Texas college, working in Exxon in the midst of graduates from Harvard, Yale, and the Wharton School of Business. And so I was very privileged in being able to obtain that job. Later on, I went on to become a controller and auditor and a treasurer of a small corporation. Then I moved to a larger company as a controller in South Texas. From there, I moved to Michigan as a plant manager. And I worked also in Pennsylvania sometime, also supervising a plant, a manufacturing plant. At one time, the largest plant I ever managed was about $160 million a year. in today's dollars. So it was about 100 million back then. I had about 200 employees. I came to Illinois after they closed that plant down, and I had a smaller plant, but I managed to double or triple the business in about 3 or 4 years. It was really in poor condition, so I was a specialist actually in working bad enterprises and improving them, bringing them up to snuff. That was my specialty.
So what do you think your parents, well, you've spoken of your parents, and I wish I could have met them, or, you know, what would they say if they saw you today and they heard of your accomplishments? What would they think or say or feel?
Well, unfortunately, they both passed away. My father passed away in 1963, and that was the year that we ended our migrant work. And my mother passed away exactly 6 years to the day after he passed away in 1969. I'm sure they would be very proud. I'm sure that they would have said, mission accomplished.
Mission accomplished. So,
They
well,
didn't know the word mission back then, but yeah, that's what it would have been.
it would have been. All right. Is there any questions that you wish I'd asked you, or things that you would like to tell us? Because this will be on, you know, the Windsor Severance Historical Society webpage. It'll be available, you know, on YouTube video for people to watch. Is there things you would like to speak of or tell us
The
more?
only thing I can say is I'm really, really impressed with the progress that happened through the years in Windsor. I know that a lot of things have transpired. The beet factory closed down. I don't think there's a pickle industry left anymore. I'm not sure about the beet industry either. I am very amazed at what's happening today. The downtown is unrecognizable from what I remember. There were no trees on Main Street as far as I can remember. And of course now it's very pretty, it's tree lined. There's some nice restaurants. We visited a couple of those restaurants when we were there. And yeah, I'm very impressed with the progress that has been made in Windsor, Colorado.
Yeah.
And I'm happy to visit there, even though I don't recognize what it used to be.
We hope you'll come again, and that I can meet you in person, and that. But I thank you for your time. I thank you for your integrity and your stories and your willingness to share it via Zoom and new technology. And it has been just my great honor and pleasure to interview with you today, Mr.
It was my pleasure.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.